Northern California, Route 36, June 2017. The Hells Angels convoy had been riding for 3 hours, 99 bikes heading east from Eureka toward their annual memorial run honoring fallen brothers. They were moving at highway speed, a disciplined formation that stretched nearly a mile along the two-lane road, cutting through dense forest. When the barefoot girl in the red dress burst from the tree line, screaming and waving her arms, the lead rider's immediate thought was that this was an ambush. But the terror on the 7-year-old's face was too genuine, her voice too raw with panic, her body too covered in dirt and blood. She ran directly at the lead bike, her words barely coherent but their meaning unmistakable. "They hung my mother from a tree. Please, save her. They're going to kill her." The president of the Oakland chapter, a man called Reaper, who'd seen combat in Desert Storm and thought nothing could shock him anymore, hit his brakes and signaled the convoy to stop. What this child revealed in the next 60 seconds would transform a memorial run into a rescue operation, expose a survivalist compound that had operated beyond the law for 15 years, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is assume that monsters only exist in movies. If you value stories about people acting when action is the only moral choice, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts of courage under pressure. The girl's name was Lily Patterson, and she'd been running through the forest for 40 minutes, her bare feet torn and bleeding from rocks and thorns. She'd escaped from a compound 3 miles into the woods, a collection of buildings hidden so deep in the national forest that even local law enforcement hadn't known it existed. Her mother, Sarah Patterson, was hanging from a tree in what the compound's leader called purification discipline. Suspended by her wrists with her toes barely touching the ground, left there as punishment for trying to escape with Lily 2 days earlier. Lily had been told to stay in the punishment shed while her mother was disciplined, but she'd managed to work loose a board in the wall and squeeze through. She'd run blindly through the forest, following the sound of engines in the distance, praying that whoever she found would help rather than return her to the compound. When she'd burst onto the highway and seen the motorcycles, her 7-year-old mind had processed only one thing. These were strong men who looked tough enough to fight the people who were hurting her mother. Reaper dismounted and approached the child carefully, recognizing severe trauma when he saw it. The girl was hyperventilating, covered in bruises at various stages of healing, malnourished, and showing signs of both physical and psychological abuse. He knelt to her eye level and spoke in the calm voice he'd learned in the army for dealing with civilians in crisis. "I'm Reaper. What's your name?" "Lily Patterson. They have my mom. They hung her from a tree and they're going to leave her there until she dies. Please, you have to help her." "Who hung her? Where is she?" "The compound. Brother Elijah's compound. It's in the forest. My mom tried to get us out, and they caught us, and now they're punishing her, and if we don't help, she's going to die." Reaper's road captain, a man named Snake, who'd been riding with him for 20 years, had approached and was calling 911 on his cell phone, but Reaper understood immediately that they had a time problem. If this woman was suspended by her wrists, she could die from positional asphyxiation within hours, as her body weight restricted her breathing. Law enforcement response in this remote area would take at least 30 to 45 minutes, and that might be too late. He turned to Snake. "How long for sheriff's response?" "Dispatch says 40 minutes minimum. They're sending deputies from Weaverville and an ambulance from Redding." Reaper looked back at Lily. "Can you show us where your mother is?" "Yes, but we have to hurry." "Please." The decision Reaper made in the next 5 seconds would later be examined by law enforcement, attorneys, and media. He was the president of a Hells Angels chapter, which meant every action he took would be scrutinized through the lens of the club's outlaw reputation. Leading 99 bikers into a forest to invade private property could be painted as vigilante action or gang activity. But he also understood that a woman was dying and minutes mattered more than legal considerations. "Everyone, listen up," Reaper's voice carried down the line of bikes. "We have a woman in medical distress approximately 3 miles into the forest. She's being held against her will at some kind of compound. Deputies are 40 minutes out. This child says her mother is going to die if we don't act immediately. I'm going in. Anyone who doesn't want legal complications, you stay with the bikes. No shame in that, but I could use help." Every single rider dismounted. 99 Hells Angels, ranging in age from 24 to 72, prepared to follow their president into unknown danger to save a woman they'd never met. Several were veterans with combat experience. Others were tradesmen, mechanics, business owners. All of them understood that the club's code required action when someone needed help, regardless of legal niceties. Reaper designated 10 riders to stay with the bikes and direct law enforcement when they arrived. The remaining 89 would follow Lily into the forest. Several members had served in law enforcement or military and took point positions. Others fell into formation based on capability and experience, creating a disciplined unit rather than a mob. Lily led them off the highway and into the dense forest, moving with the desperate speed of a child trying to save her mother. The bikers followed, their leather and denim making them look like an invading army as they moved through trees and underbrush. Some had weapons, legal firearms carried for protection during long rides. But Reaper had given clear instructions that weapons stayed concealed unless lives were in immediate danger. The compound appeared after 25 minutes of difficult hiking. It consisted of 7 buildings arranged around a central clearing, all constructed from rough lumber and appearing to have been built over many years. The largest building had a crude cross mounted on its front, suggesting religious purpose. Smaller structures appeared to be living quarters, and in the center of the clearing, exactly as Lily had described, a woman hung from a tree by her wrists, her body limp but showing slight movement that indicated she was still alive. The compound's residents had heard the approach of 89 people moving through the forest and had gathered in defensive positions. Approximately 30 adults, mostly men, stood around the clearing with firearms visible. They wore similar clothing, a mix of military surplus and homemade garments that suggested both poverty and deliberate rejection of mainstream society. At the front of this group stood a man Lily identified as Brother Elijah, a figure in his 50s with a long beard and the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. He held a rifle but hadn't raised it yet, clearly processing the sight of nearly 90 bikers emerging from the forest into his compound. Reaper walked forward alone, hands visible and empty, stopping 20 feet from Elijah. "We're taking the woman down and getting her medical attention. We've called law enforcement and they're on their way. You can cooperate or you can have problems, but that woman is leaving with us." Elijah's expression was a mix of rage and calculation. "You're trespassing on private property. This is a religious community, and you have no right to be here. That woman is being disciplined according to our beliefs, and you have no authority to interfere. She's a human being in medical distress. Your religious beliefs don't give you the right to torture someone to death. Now we can wait here for the sheriff and let them handle this. But that woman's coming down from that tree right now." The standoff lasted perhaps 15 seconds before several things happened simultaneously. Lily broke from behind the bikers and ran toward her mother, screaming, "Mommy!" 2 of the compound men moved to intercept her, and Reaper's combat instincts, honed in Desert Storm, recognized that they had approximately 3 seconds before this situation became violent. "Back off the child!" Reaper's command voice stopped the compound men mid-stride. They looked to Elijah for direction while Lily reached her mother and tried unsuccessfully to lift her mother's weight off her suspended wrists. Sarah Patterson was conscious, but barely. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow and labored, her body showing the effects of hours of suspension. Medical studies would later show she had perhaps 15 to 20 minutes before positional asphyxiation would have killed her. Reaper signaled to two of his members, both military veterans who moved forward despite the rifles pointed at them. They approached the tree and began working to release Sarah's bindings, while other bikers formed a protective ring around them. The compound men were outnumbered nearly 3-1, and the bikers' formation made it clear that shooting would result in immediate, overwhelming response. Elijah raised his rifle, pointing it at Reaper. "You're making a grave mistake. This is God's land, and you're interfering with his judgment." "I'm interfering with torture," Reaper replied calmly, "and you're pointing a weapon at me in front of 90 witnesses and about 15 different camera phones recording this, so think carefully about your next move." It was true. Multiple bikers had pulled out phones and were recording the confrontation. Whatever happened next would be documented from multiple angles, which changed Elijah's calculation about use of force. Sarah was lowered from the tree and immediately collapsed. The two bikers who'd cut her down called for medical help, and a member named Doc, who actually was a retired emergency medicine physician, pushed through to assess her. He checked pulse, breathing, circulation, and began treating for shock and exposure. "She needs an ambulance immediately," Doc called out. "Oh, she's got maybe 20 minutes before organ failure starts." Reaper turned back to Elijah. "Ambulance is already coming. We're taking her back to the highway to meet it. If you try to stop us, this gets a lot uglier for you than it needs to be." The standoff continued while Doc and several others prepared to carry Sarah out of the compound. Lily clung to her mother, crying and trying to wake her. The compound residents maintained their defensive positions, but hadn't escalated to actual violence, likely recognizing that they were severely outnumbered and every action was being recorded. Then Elijah made a decision that revealed the extent of his control over the compound. "Kill them all. God has sent these demons to test our faith. We will not be found wanting." Several compound men raised their weapons. The bikers with concealed firearms drew them in response. And for approximately 5 seconds, 60 people stood with weapons pointed at each other, while a dying woman lay between them and a 7-year-old girl cried for her mother. What happened next would be analyzed by law enforcement, debated in courtrooms, and studied as a case example of crisis intervention. Reaper made a choice that potentially saved dozens of lives through sheer tactical awareness and years of experience making split-second decisions under fire. "Everyone stand down," he commanded, his voice carrying authority that made even the compound residents pause. "Elijah, you kill us. You spend life in prison, and your compound gets raided by every federal agency that has jurisdiction here. My people die, their brothers come looking for answers, and you've got a war you can't win. Or you let us take this woman and child. We tell the deputies she wandered onto your property, and you had no idea who she was. And maybe this ends without anyone dying today." Elijah's calculation was visible on his face as he processed Reaper's offer. He was a man accustomed to absolute control over his compound, but he was also smart enough to recognize when tactical retreat was the only survivable option. His 30 armed followers might win the initial firefight through surprise, but they'd lose the aftermath. Every law enforcement agency in California would descend on the compound if 90 Hell's Angels were killed or wounded on this property. "Take her," Elijah said finally, lowering his rifle. "But the child stays. She was born here. She belongs to the community." "The child goes with her mother," Reaper replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Non-negotiable." For a moment it appeared Elijah would refuse, but one of his men whispered something urgent in his ear. Probably a reminder that kidnapping charges would bring federal attention they couldn't survive. Elijah nodded with visible reluctance. "Take them both. But you tell the authorities that woman came here of her own free will and left the same way. This was a religious retreat, nothing more. Reaper didn't agree or disagree, just signaled for his people to move. 4 bikers fashioned a stretcher from their leather jackets and carried Sarah toward the forest trail, with Doc monitoring her vitals and Lily staying pressed against her mother's side. The remaining bikers formed a protective perimeter, walking backward to keep eyes on the compound residents while moving toward the tree line. The retreat took 35 minutes of tense movement through dense forest with an unconscious woman on a makeshift stretcher. Multiple times Sarah stopped breathing and Doc had to perform rescue breathing to restart her respiratory drive. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and everyone understood they were in a race against organ failure. They reached the highway to find sheriff's deputies, and an ambulance had arrived. The paramedics immediately took over Sarah's care, establishing an IV line and administering oxygen while preparing her for transport. Her vital signs were critical: blood pressure 70/40, heart rate 140, respiratory rate 8. The lead paramedic, a woman named Jennifer Chen, gave Doc a grim look that communicated she wasn't sure Sarah would survive the transport to Reading Medical Center. Lily refused to leave her mother's side, clinging to the stretcher even as paramedics tried to work. Finally, Jennifer knelt beside her and spoke gently. "Sweetie, we need to help your mom, and we can't do that with you in the way. Can you ride in the ambulance but sit in the front seat? You can still see her, but you'll let us work." Lily agreed reluctantly, allowing herself to be guided to the ambulance's passenger seat while Jennifer and her partner loaded Sarah. The ambulance departed with lights and sirens, beginning the 90-minute emergency transport to the only trauma center in the region. Sheriff's Deputy Mike Torres approached Reaper with an expression that mixed appreciation and frustration. "You want to explain to me what the hell just happened here? I've got reports of 99 bikers invading private property, armed with weapons." Reaper had already prepared his statement, knowing this conversation would determine whether he faced charges. "We were riding Route 36 when that little girl ran out of the forest screaming her mother was dying. She led us to a compound where we found a woman suspended from a tree by her wrists, clearly in medical distress. We cut her down and brought her out to meet your ambulance. That's what happened." "And the weapons? Multiple residents of that compound are saying you and your people were armed and threatening." "Several of my members legally carry firearms for protection during long rides. We didn't draw them until compound residents pointed rifles at us while we were rendering medical aid. Everything we did was defensive and for the purpose of saving that woman's life." Torres studied Reaper's face, clearly trying to determine how much of this story was accurate versus convenient narrative. "I'm going to need statements from everyone who entered that compound, and I'm going to need to see the footage from all those phones you people were recording with. You'll have full cooperation," Reaper said. "But I suggest you investigate that compound. The child showed signs of severe abuse. The woman nearly died from torture they called religious discipline. And I'd bet everything I own that if you look carefully, you'll find more victims." Torres's expression shifted to something more serious. "That's actually why I'm here. We've been trying to get eyes on this compound for 3 years based on reports from people who escaped, but we haven't had probable cause for a search warrant. You just gave us that cause." What Reaper didn't know yet was that Sarah Patterson's near-death and Lily's escape would open an investigation into one of the most disturbing survivalist compounds in California history. The compound, officially registered as the Restoration Fellowship, had operated for 15 years under the leadership of Elijah James, a former insurance salesman who declared himself a prophet after a mental health crisis in 2002. The fellowship had started as a small group of survivalist families seeking to live off-grid and prepare for what Elijah predicted was coming: societal collapse. But over the years, it had evolved into something darker, an authoritarian religious community where Elijah's word was absolute law and disobedience was punished through isolation, forced labor, and physical discipline. Sarah Patterson had joined the fellowship in 2012, a single mother fleeing an abusive relationship and seeking safe community for herself and infant Lily. What she'd found instead was a different kind of abuse, one disguised as religious discipline and spiritual guidance. By the time she recognized the fellowship for what it was, leaving had become nearly impossible. The compound was located miles from the nearest road. Members had no access to phones or outside communication, and Elijah had made clear that attempting to leave would result in permanent separation of parents from their children. Sarah had spent 5 years planning her escape, secretly gathering supplies and teaching Lily how to navigate by the sun. Their attempt 2 days earlier had failed when another fellowship member spotted them hiking toward the road and reported them to Elijah. The purification discipline had been Elijah's response, a torture method he used to break the will of anyone who challenged his authority. At Reading Medical Center, Sarah underwent emergency surgery to address muscle damage from suspension trauma and kidney failure from rhabdomyolysis. Her surgeons would later testify that she'd been approximately 10 minutes from irreversible organ damage when the ambulance arrived. The bikers' intervention had literally saved her life. Lily was examined in the emergency department and found to have multiple healed fractures, signs of chronic malnutrition and psychological trauma consistent with severe abuse. A social worker from Child Protective Services interviewed her gently, and what Lily described, systematic abuse of children, forced labor, isolation as punishment, and religious indoctrination that taught absolute obedience to Elijah, prompted immediate action. Within 6 hours of Sarah's rescue, a joint task force of sheriff's deputies, FBI agents, and Child Protective Services workers obtained an emergency search warrant for the Restoration Fellowship compound. The operation, conducted at dawn the following morning, found conditions that shocked even experienced investigators. 17 children lived at the compound, ranging in age from 2 to 16. All showed signs of neglect and abuse. They slept in unheated sheds with inadequate bedding, wore clothing that was little more than rags, and had no access to medical care or education. Several had untreated medical conditions including infections, broken bones that had healed incorrectly, and dental problems so severe they required immediate intervention. The adults at the compound, 28 in total, claimed they were there voluntarily and that the fellowship represented their sincere religious beliefs. But interviews revealed a pattern of coercion and control. Members who wanted to leave were told they'd be damned to hell. Parents who questioned Elijah's authority were separated from their children. Anyone who resisted was subjected to purification discipline, similar to what Sarah had experienced. Elijah James was arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, child abuse, assault with intent to commit great bodily injury, and operating a criminal enterprise. His bail was set at $5 million based on flight risk and danger to the community. 12 other adult fellowship members were charged with various crimes related to child abuse and false imprisonment. The investigation also revealed financial crimes. Elijah had convinced members to sign over their assets when joining the fellowship, claiming communal ownership. But financial records showed he'd been using these funds for personal expenses, while members lived in poverty. Charges of fraud and theft were added to his indictment. The 17 children removed from the compound required specialized care. Most had never attended school, had no identification documents, and had been taught that the outside world was evil and dangerous. Foster families with experience in cult deprogramming were recruited, and a long process of education and therapy began. Lily Patterson remained with her mother, who spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from her physical injuries. The psychological recovery would take much longer. Sarah suffered from PTSD, night terrors, and overwhelming guilt about the 5 years she'd allowed Lily to be abused. But she also demonstrated remarkable resilience, cooperating fully with prosecutors and becoming the most important witness against Elijah. Meanwhile, the Hells Angels who'd participated in the rescue found themselves dealing with unexpected media attention. The story of 99 bikers rescuing a woman from a cult compound had gone viral, with footage from multiple cell phones viewed millions of times. Public reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with people praising the club for their courage and quick action, but not everyone saw it positively. Some law enforcement officials and legal experts criticized the bikers for taking matters into their own hands, arguing they should have waited for proper authority rather than invading private property. Civil libertarians worried about the precedent of armed groups conducting vigilante rescues, and predictably, some media outlets focused on the Hells Angels' outlaw reputation rather than the life-saving rescue. Reaper found himself giving interviews to explain what had happened, something he'd never done before and wasn't comfortable doing. But he recognized that the club's reputation was at stake and that silence would let others control the narrative. "We didn't go in there looking to be heroes," he told one reporter. "We went in there because a little girl said her mother was dying and we had the capability to help. Would you have us ride away and let that woman die while we waited for proper authority? Because that's what the critics are suggesting we should have done." The interview resonated with the public, and support for the bikers increased. A crowdfunding campaign to cover their potential legal expenses raised over $200,000 in 3 days, far more than needed. The excess was donated to organizations supporting survivors of religious abuse. The legal analysis of the rescue eventually determined that the bikers had acted lawfully. They'd responded to a medical emergency reported by a child. They'd used minimum necessary force, and they'd cooperated fully with law enforcement afterward. No charges were filed against any of the 99 riders who'd entered the compound. Elijah's trial began in March 2018, 10 months after the rescue. Sarah testified for 6 hours, describing her 5 years at the compound and Elijah's systematic abuse of authority. Lily testified via closed-circuit television, her testimony brief but devastating. Other former fellowship members described similar experiences of coercion and abuse. The defense argued that the fellowship represented sincere religious beliefs and that members had joined voluntarily. But the prosecution presented evidence of systematic isolation, financial exploitation, and torture that went far beyond religious practice. Medical experts testified about Sarah's injuries and how close she'd come to death. Child psychologists described the trauma inflicted on the compound's children. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning guilty verdicts on 47 of 52 counts, including the most serious charges. The sentencing hearing for Elijah James took place in June 2018. 1 year after the rescue, Judge Patricia Morrison presided over a courtroom packed with former fellowship members, victims, families, media, and several of the Hells Angels who'd participated in the rescue. Elijah sat impassively at the defense table, showing no emotion as victim after victim described the harm he'd caused. Sarah Patterson spoke last, Lily sitting beside her in the gallery. "For 5 years, I lived under your control. You convinced me that the outside world was evil, that leaving would damn my soul, that you spoke with God's authority. You used my faith against me, turned my love for my daughter into a tool of manipulation. When I finally found the courage to escape, you hung me from a tree and left me to die as a lesson to others who might try to leave. But you failed, because a 7-year-old girl was braver than you ever were. She ran through a forest alone, barefoot and terrified, and found help. And because 99 strangers chose compassion over indifference, I'm alive to see you face justice. Judge Morrison delivered the sentence without preamble: life in prison without possibility of parole on the kidnapping and torture charges, plus consecutive sentences on the child abuse and fraud convictions. Elijah would die in prison, and the judge made clear why. Mr. James, you built an empire of suffering disguised as religious community. You exploited people's faith, their desire for safety and belonging, and turned it into a system of control and abuse. You tortured a woman nearly to death for trying to protect her child. You abused children systematically while claiming divine authority. The law allows me to ensure you never have the opportunity to harm anyone else again, and I'm exercising that authority fully. The other fellowship members received sentences ranging from probation to 15 years, depending on their level of participation in the abuse. Several received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony and cooperation with ongoing investigations into similar compounds in other states. The 17 children removed from the compound faced long roads to recovery. Most required years of therapy to overcome the indoctrination and abuse. Some struggled with basic social skills, having been isolated from normal society during critical developmental years. But all of them eventually found stable placements, either reunited with family members who'd left the fellowship years earlier, or placed with specialized foster families trained in cult deprogramming. Sarah and Lily Patterson's recovery became a case study in trauma treatment and resilience. Sarah worked with a therapist specializing in cult survivors, processing the guilt, shame, and psychological damage from her 5 years under Elijah's control. The therapy was difficult and painful, forcing her to confront how she'd been manipulated and how she'd failed to protect Lily adequately. But Sarah also demonstrated remarkable strength. She found a job as a cashier at a grocery store in Reading, rented a small apartment, and slowly built a normal life for herself and Lily. She attended every court hearing related to the fellowship, testifying whenever needed and supporting other survivors through their own legal and therapeutic processes. Lily's recovery was complicated by her age. At 7 years old, she'd spent her entire remembered life at the compound. Normal things like television, cars, and grocery stores were overwhelming initially. School was particularly challenging because she'd never been educated and was years behind her peers academically. But the Reading School District provided specialized support, and Lily proved to be a quick learner once given the opportunity. By 3rd grade, she'd caught up to grade level in reading and math. By 5th grade, she was excelling academically and had developed friendships with classmates who knew nothing about her past, beyond the fact that she'd been homeschooled before moving to Reading. The relationship between the Patterson family and the Hells Angels evolved in unexpected ways. Reaper stayed in contact with Sarah, checking in monthly to see how she and Lily were doing. The club organized a fundraiser for the family, raising $45,000 that allowed Sarah to buy a reliable car and establish a financial cushion for emergencies. More significantly, the Angels became an extended family of sorts. Several members had daughters near Lily's age, and they organized activities that let Lily experience normal childhood experiences she'd missed: birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese, trips to the beach, movie nights, camping trips to national parks, all the ordinary things that most children take for granted but that Lily had never experienced. On Lily's 8th birthday, 6 months after the rescue, Reaper and his wife showed up at the Pattersons' apartment with a bicycle, something Lily had never owned. She spent the afternoon learning to ride in the apartment complex parking lot, falling repeatedly but refusing to give up, while Reaper ran alongside, providing encouragement and catching her when she lost balance. "You're the toughest kid I know," Reaper told her during a water break. "You ran through a forest alone to save your mom. Learning to ride a bike is nothing compared to that." Lily considered this seriously. It was easier to run through the forest because I knew my mum needed me. The bike is harder because I'm just doing it for fun. The wisdom in that observation struck Reaper deeply. This child had survived conditions that would have broken most adults, but normal childhood activities felt challenging because she'd never been allowed to be a child. The contrast highlighted how much the fellowship had stolen from her. The story of the rescue continued to resonate beyond the immediate participants. Multiple news outlets did long-form journalism pieces about the fellowship, examining how such an abusive organization had operated undetected for 15 years. The coverage led to policy changes in California regarding oversight of religious communities and off-grid settlements. Law enforcement agencies developed new protocols for investigating reports of abuse in isolated communities, recognizing that the traditional approach of waiting for probable cause had allowed the fellowship to victimize people for over a decade. The new protocols emphasized proactive investigation and coordination between agencies. National organizations focused on religious abuse and cult recovery used the fellowship case as a teaching example. The warning signs were clear in retrospect: isolation from outside contact, financial exploitation, absolute authority claimed by a single leader, harsh punishment for dissent, and doctrine that justified abuse as religious discipline. Several former fellowship members became advocates for cult awareness and prevention, speaking at conferences and working with organizations that help people exit high-control groups. Their stories provided valuable insights into how intelligent, well-meaning people could be drawn into abusive situations, and why leaving was so difficult even when the abuse was obvious. The Hells Angels' role in the rescue also had lasting impact on how the public perceived motorcycle clubs. The overwhelmingly positive media coverage challenged stereotypes about outlaw bikers, showing that the reality was more complex than popular culture suggested. Several chapters increased their community service activities, hosting charity rides and fundraisers that attracted positive attention. Reaper found himself in the unexpected position of being a spokesperson for responsible motorcycle culture. He gave interviews explaining that most motorcycle clubs were social organizations of people who enjoyed riding, not criminal enterprises. He emphasized that the Angels' Code included helping people in need, particularly women and children in danger. "We're not angels in the religious sense," he told one interviewer, "but we try to live by a code that includes taking care of our community." When that little girl ran out of the forest asking for help, there was never a question about whether we'd help. The only question was how to do it safely. By Lily's 10th birthday in 2019, her life looked remarkably normal. She excelled in school, played soccer, had close friends, and showed no obvious signs of the trauma she'd experienced beyond occasional nightmares. Sarah had been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store and was taking community college classes with the goal of becoming a social worker focused on helping cult survivors. The Pattersons attended the Hells Angels annual memorial ride that year, riding as passengers in support vehicles rather than on bikes. The event had become personally meaningful to them, a reminder of the day strangers had risked their safety to save their lives. They'd become part of the extended Angels family, invited to parties and events, welcomed as members of the community. During a quiet moment at the memorial ride, Sarah approached Reaper with a question she'd been considering for months. "Why did you do it? You didn't know us. You had no obligation to help. You could have waited for the police and avoided all the legal risk. Why did you immediately decide to go into that compound?" Reaper thought about this for a moment. "I spent 20 years in the army, did 2 tours in Desert Storm. You know what I learned? That hesitation costs lives. When someone needs help, you act. You don't debate about jurisdiction or proper procedure or legal liability. You act, and you deal with consequences afterward. That little girl said her mother was dying. Everything else was secondary to that fact. But 99 of you followed. You didn't have to. They could have stayed with the bikes. That's the brotherhood. When your president says someone needs help, you don't debate it. You trust that the call is legitimate, and you respond. Every single one of those guys understood we might face legal consequences. They came anyway, because that's what the club is about. We take care of our own, and sometimes our own includes strangers who need help. The conversation reflected a truth about the rescue that media coverage often missed. The Angels hadn't acted heroically because they were exceptionally good people. They'd acted because their code required it, and their brotherhood enabled it. Put those same 99 individuals in different circumstances, without the club's structure and culture, and the response might have been different. But as Hell's Angels, riding together under their club code, they'd been positioned to act decisively when action mattered. In 2020, Sarah Patterson graduated from community college with an associate degree in social work. She was accepted into a bachelor's program at California State University, Chico, with the goal of specializing in cult recovery and religious abuse. Her personal experience, combined with formal education, positioned her to help others navigate the same difficult transition she'd made. Lily, now 13, had developed into a confident, articulate teenager who occasionally spoke at events about her experience. She'd learned to frame her story in ways that educated without traumatizing listeners, focusing on resilience and recovery rather than the worst details of abuse. People ask me if I'm angry about the years I lost, she told an audience at a cult awareness conference. And yes, I'm angry, but I'm also grateful. I'm grateful for my mom's courage in trying to escape. I'm grateful for the bikers who stopped when I ran onto the highway. I'm grateful for the therapists who helped us heal. I'm grateful for every person who chose to help rather than look away. Anger at the past doesn't help as much as gratitude for the present. The fellowship compound remained abandoned, the buildings slowly deteriorating as the forest reclaimed the clearing. The property was seized through civil forfeiture and eventually sold, with proceeds distributed among victims for restitution. The new owner bulldozed all the buildings and planted trees, wanting no trace of what had occurred there. But the lessons of the fellowship endured. Law enforcement was more vigilant about isolated communities. Mental health professionals were better trained to recognize cult indoctrination, and ordinary citizens were more aware that abuse could hide behind religious rhetoric and that intervention was sometimes necessary even when legally complicated. On June 15, 2022, the 5th anniversary of the rescue, Sarah and Lily Patterson attended a memorial ride organized by the Hells Angels. The event had grown over the years, now including several hundred riders from multiple clubs and raising money for organizations that helped cult survivors and abused children. Reaper, now in his 60s and still riding, gave a short speech before the ride began. 5 years ago, a brave little girl ran out of a forest and asked strangers for help. She could have given up. She could have hidden. But she fought for her mother's life, and because of her courage, we were able to help. This ride celebrates that courage and reminds us that we all have responsibility to act when we see injustice. Whether you're on a bike or in a car, whether you're part of a club or riding solo, whether you're comfortable or scared, when someone needs help, you respond. That's what being human requires. The ride stretched for miles, several hundred motorcycles moving through Northern California in formation. Sarah and Lily rode with Reaper, 3 people bound together by a moment of crisis that had transformed all their lives. As they rode, Lily thought about the terrified 7-year-old she'd been, running barefoot through the forest with no certainty that anyone would help. She thought about the 99 bikers who'd stopped, who'd followed her into danger, who'd risked themselves for strangers. She thought about her mother's courage in trying to escape despite knowing the consequences. And she thought about the future she now had, full of possibilities that would have been impossible if any part of that day had gone differently. The rescue had taken maybe 2 hours, from Lily running onto the highway to Sarah being loaded into the ambulance. But those 2 hours had saved lives, destroyed an abusive organization, and proved that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop when someone asks for help. The Hells Angels had been heading to a memorial ride that day. They'd ended up creating a moment worth memorializing, a reminder that brotherhood and compassion could overcome fear and indifference when action was required.